Hello, my name is Joe Clark, and I'm a junior at the University of Alabama studying mathematics, finance, and economics. This semester, I spent my time doing research with Dr. Lou Marino within the Culverhouse College of Business's Department of Management. My research project is titled The Everdeen Paradox, when you have to conform to be independent. Before we start, it's imperative that we consider the background literature that set the foundation for our topic of study. There is evidence that suggests that neurodivergence in individuals leads to an increased likelihood in them pursuing entrepreneurial action. For the purposes of our research, we should consider neurodivergence to be reacting to certain circumstances differently than normal people might do. This can be blanketed in terms such as autism, ADHD, and other like conditions where people have certain circumstances that lead them to react differently. In these circumstances, we can find that applies directly to entrepreneurship because this is a field of study and career where you can deal with circumstances that you set for yourself. It is essentially creating your own job, and in doing such, you can set your own boundaries and adapt the challenges to meet your advantages. While you may have some limitations due to this neurodivergence, you also have some advantages, and neurodivergence allows you to exploit those to the fullest capabilities. In a similar vein of thought, there is also research that suggests that neurodivergence may lead to stigma in certain communities. This has been found particularly in certain minority communities around the US. There are a few prevailing theories for why this is the case, but the important thought is that having neurodivergence leads you to be cast as an outsider because you react to circumstances differently than other people. This allows people to be cast aside and viewed differently and may not give them the same advantages as it would if you were viewed as one of the collective. What we're doing with these two trains of thought is we're attempting to find a bridge. We're using this prior research to be a springboard for an exploratory analysis trying to bridge these two connections together. Essentially, what we're looking for is a possible cause and effect here. We know that neurodivergence leads to an increased likelihood in pursuing entrepreneurial action, and we know that neurodivergence in certain communities may lead you to be stigmatized and may prevent you from getting the full benefit of the resources available. So perhaps there is a link between neurodivergence being a limiting factor, also limiting individuals in minority communities from pursuing entrepreneurial action. We use this potential bridge to perform an exploratory analysis and conduct research using secondary data. Our path here was clear. We needed to use secondary data as a springboard for an exploratory analysis, and from there, if we were to examine a trend that matches our train of thought, we could form a hypothesis and then structure new surveys to create more valuable primary data that allows us to more effectively pursue a conclusion. From there, we could use this primary data and evidence as analyses for a potential conclusion in support or in evidence against this hypothesis. The first step was to find a source of secondary data, though. We opted for the National Longitudinal Survey data, as I will now refer to as the NLS data, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This comprises over 100,000 individual observations, comprising a variety of fields, such as health, employment, family information, and importantly, neurodivergence, which they blanketed with terms such as autism, ADHD, and ADD, among other conditions. We use the NLS data to form a variety of analyses, and we use this as evidence in support or against the potential hypothesis that we formed. The goal here was to find trends and to find ways to explain these trends. We looked for statistical significance, and from there, we could springboard and find potential conclusions and go into a more detailed primary data search on these conclusions. As such, we had to define a procedure that allows us to test different groups. Because our focus was on different sorts of communities, we stratified first into 3 separate groups of race. We examined Hispanic groups, Black groups, and non-Black, non-Hispanic groups. From there, we identified our parameters. We had a few controlling variables as well as different parameters that were tested along these controlling variables. The controlling variables included, but were not limited to, entrepreneurial action and prior family history of entrepreneurship. This is important because if you come from a family of entrepreneurial history, you are more likely to pursue entrepreneurship as a career study because you have family history, you may take over a family business, or you were raised in an environment that praises that sort of thing, and so you can pursue it more likely. As for the other variables that we wanted to test, we of course tested neurodivergence, keyly autism and ADHD in our circumstances, as well as community factors and the sociopathy associated with these individuals. Sociopathy is an important variable because it tests how easy you are to read the room, essentially. It allows you to fit in better or worse, and it tests how well you can fit in with certain groups. From there, we wanted to analyze these with a few different variables that we mixed in and see what conclusions we could come to. The primary conclusion we saw was this interesting trend. As you'll see, on the y-axis, it gauges your likelihood to view yourself as an entrepreneur. On the x-axis is a range of low ADHD and high ADHD based on score on a centralized test. These results are specifically for the Hispanic community. As you'll see, on the trend line with low sociopathy, there is a statistically significant upward trend in individuals being more likely to view themselves as an entrepreneur if they have high levels of ADHD. Contrarily, if you have high levels of sociopathy and high levels of ADHD, you are less likely to perceive yourself as an entrepreneur. This is interesting because you can note this in a few different ways. For one, we did not notice this trend within the Black community nor the non-Hispanic, non-Black community. It also suggests that individuals with high levels of sociopathy are less likely to perceive themselves this way, while individuals with low levels of sociopathy are more likely to perceive themselves this way. Considering we define sociopathy as an ability to read the room and identify social norms, this is an important trend, and it is how we came to our final hypothesis, which is the namesake of the presentation and future analysis. This is the Everdeen paradox. In a society where one can be ostracized for their differences, it is imperative that they conceal these differences in order to gain full access to the resources available to them. The namesake of this paradox is, of course, Katniss Everdeen, the protagonist of the popular film and novel series The Hunger Games. Katniss is portrayed as an ordinary girl early in the series, yet it quickly becomes evident that she is anything but ordinary. Yet she still needs to conceal her extraordinary nature and her influence because there is a threat of being banished or even killed. From here, she quickly becomes better at analyzing her resources and building strength, and quickly becomes the revolutionary figure that she was meant to be. In a similar vein of thought, neurodivergent individuals have strengths that they can play to, yet they need to conceal these strengths in order to play to the community better. Our hypothesis is that these individuals with low levels of sociopathy are able to read the room better. They're able to blend in and hide these differences well enough that they can gain the support and trust of a community and better blend in and achieve the goals that they so have. From there, they can gain their resources and gain strength. For future research, we wanted to look at different ways that we could apply this research to a variety of communities. Our first goal was to create a survey with more pointed questions that may point to the conclusion and hypothesis that we have. From there, we want to identify communities that we could send this survey to. We noted that the community that we're looking at was the Hispanic community. So we want to identify areas and groups that would be willing to take this survey and allow us to accumulate primary data that would be valuable for future analysis. From there, we would have wide-scale data survey distribution, and once we accumulate all the data that we're looking for, we can analyze it, form conclusions, and of course, either refute or confirm the hypothesis that we formed. There are a lot of steps to take in between, but we have a firm hypothesis, and from there we can test it. Here is a bibliography of the resources that I had for this, many of which are relating to neurodivergence and entrepreneurship, and neurodivergence leading to stigma in minority communities, as these were the springboard for the exploratory analysis that we had. I would now like to open the floor up to any questions.
Were there any other findings during your initial exploratory analysis that you might have found interesting?
As I referenced, there were a few variables that we tested, and there were a lot of different conclusions that we came to that had different series of statistical significance. Of course, the main one that we focused on for this study was what we deemed the Everdeen paradox, but there are a few that might seem contrary to our initial hypothesis about the causation between neurodivergence and stigmatization and a lack of entrepreneurship. Most notably, in the Black community, there seemed to be a strong trend that individuals going to church or having a strong church in their community were more likely to perceive themselves as an entrepreneur. On a basis, this might seem to be unlikely because church is a strong centralized community where you must blend in and be centralized in order to have a good standing. So this seems to be contrary, but there might be other reasons for this, and it is actually an area that we found interesting and might pursue additional study in.
How do you defend that this paradox is the reason for the lack of entrepreneurship, while there are other difficulties that poor, more centralized ethnic communities may face?
So according to the Senate, the most cited difficulty in pursuing entrepreneurship, specifically in minority communities, is a lack of resources. And people may try to create a divide between this reason and the reason that we're citing, but I would like to think of them as one and the same. If you're pursuing entrepreneurship, you need to have access to the resources in your community. What we're saying is that it's important that people have full access and awareness of the resources in their community, and they're well connected with the people around them in order to achieve their goals. If you are ostracized by your community and cast as an outsider, people are less likely to do you a favor. They're less likely to promote your business, and you will have much harder time growing in the area where you start. Your community is essentially a seedling for where you want to be. And if you're not well connected with it, it's very difficult to achieve your goals.
Thank you. I'm kind of going off of that a little bit. Like, why is it that minority communities typically like stigmatize neurodiversity more than other populations might? I think you might have mentioned some literature on this, but what were the findings that justified that conclusion?
The findings were primarily through primary data studies that showed a statistically significant increase in the level of stigmatization for neurodivergent individuals in these communities. There are a few prevailing theories for why this is the case. For instance, these are collectivist communities, and there are many areas that have been previously subject to discrimination within the U.S. Just off that basis, they may perceive themselves as a minority that must be collective in its whole. If you are viewed as a weakness due to your neurodivergence and your inability to fit in, you may be more likely to be cast aside as somebody who is in a majority race may be. It is important that you're able to blend in and fit that mold, as you may be more likely to attain the resources that are necessary to thrive in that community and ultimately the greater United States community.
Sorry if I missed this, but is there an instrument or some way to measure the different levels of sociopathy that an individual may have?
There is a scale that is used within the DIRT data survey, and it has been used over the past 41 years that the NLS data has been accumulated. I do not remember the name off the top of my head, but all of these scales that we have, such as the high ADHD score, the level of autism, and their range on the spectrum, all of this has a centralized scoring method that has been used by the NLS for years, and the sociopathy is very similar in that.